Hi guys, we're going to get going on here on chapter 12. Now, at first glance, the title of chapter 12 is not going to make you think that it should be included in all of the other chapters, with all of the other chapters in this particular unit. I mentioned that this particular unit deals with cell communication, or communication between different parts of an organism, right? Or between an organism and other organisms. And at first glance, this particular chapter, the title says, now that doesn't add up, right? We kind of know about the cell cycle, the process of cell division, effectively, was what we're going to be studying here. But it turns out that this process of cell division and the cell cycle in general has all sorts of chemical communication that is occurring within it. So I will make sure to point out the parts of this particular chapter that do allude to cell communication or chemical communication within a cell itself. Okay, so we're kind of talking about all these other cellular things, and I thought it was a good spot to throw this in there because the cell cycle is vitally important to the life of the cell. And it makes sense to talk about it in regards to cell communication as well. All right. So as I just mentioned, it is this process of the cell cycle is important to the life of the cell, and depending on the type of cell that you happen to be studying, for instance, it could be important in different ways. Okay. So for instance, unicellular organisms, you think about things like even bacteria. Okay, they're unicellular, they're much simpler, they're prokaryotes, they're not eukaryotic. But if you think along the lines of something a little bit more advanced like a paramecium or an amoeba, those are eukaryotic organisms that are single-celled as well. The process of the cell cycle is utilized actually for division of the entire organism so it can reproduce. Okay, so in unicellular organisms, this is vitally important to passing on their lineage, their DNA to the next generation. It is everything that they need, right? That's them passing on their genes to the next generation. Okay, for multicellular organisms, it's still obviously very important. None of us would be here right now if it weren't for this process of the cell cycle. There we go. Of this process of the cell cycle, because in us, the cell cycle does something different. It has multiple uses, okay? So in multicellular organisms, we use it for development, number one, right? From the time we are fertilized eggs, okay, we are one cell at that very minute, that very, very second of conception, we are one cell. And obviously we grow up into these beings that are trillions and trillions and trillions of cells, right? And the only way that that happens is because of this process known as the cell cycle, okay, cell division. We also utilize cell division for growth, right? So obviously we have to develop from this single fertilized cell, but then once we are born, we have to grow, right? You're obviously not the same size as when you came out of the womb. You are much bigger. So we utilize this process for growth, okay? Not necessarily just growth of our entire bodies, but growth of, fingernails, growth of hair, growth of all sorts of stuff, extra skin, okay? So we use it to grow all different parts of our body, okay? And we also use it for repair. Multicellular organisms utilize cell cycle and cell division for repair. You get a cut, right? I don't have any fresh cuts on me right now, but let's say pretend you had a cut across your finger here, bleeding all over the place, right? And what you've done is you've effectively, once you cut your hand like that, is you've destroyed all of the cells where you had that cut. All those cells are now effectively gone, destroyed, popped, blown up, whatever. They're gone, right? And our body wants to make sure that we can fill that gap, fill that hole that was there. And so the cells that are surrounding this damaged tissue are going to divide in response to that damage, and they will actually divide to the point where they fill in the gap. Okay, so we utilize this for repair as well. Other organisms, think about lizards and things like that, can chop off their entire tail and grow a new one back, and that's due to cell division, cell cycle, right? Obviously, it'd be sweet if we could do that, but we do it in a lesser extent. We make cuts and we can still grow some of that tissue back, all right? So I just wanted to start with kind of an overview of what the cell cycle is used for before we start to get into some of the details surrounding it, okay? Now, before we get into phases of the cell cycle and phases of mitosis and all this stuff, this is stuff you've probably heard about at some point. I do want to start off simply, and I want to start talking about cell division in terms of the nucleus, because really the cell duplicates the genetic material, and this happens before the cell itself divides. So it's really important to understand that one of the big processes that happens is that the cell does duplicate the DNA, okay? And so that makes sure that each daughter cell that is ultimately produced in this process of the cell cycle, cell division, receives an identical copy of the original DNA. So it makes sense that we should probably start to talk about the nucleus and the things that are contained within the nucleus before we start talking about all of the phases and the processes and things that go into dividing the cell as a whole. So I'm going to spend a few minutes here, and this will be kind of the introductory material before we get into some of those other details, okay? So let's talk about that. The cell's endowment of DNA is called its genome. These are all things that you probably know, but I just want to make sure that we remember them and we review them, okay? DNA molecules in a cell are packaged into what we call chromosomes, okay? And those chromosomes, I don't know why that's working out like that, those chromosomes consist of what is known as chromatin, okay? And that's probably, again, a review type of piece of vocabulary for you. You've probably heard of chromatin, but you need a little refresher on it, okay? Chromatin is a complex of DNA and proteins that condense during cell division, okay? So when we think about our chromosomes, oftentimes we think about our chromosomes looking like this picture down here with the highlighters circling it, right? They look like these little X's or little butterflies. That does happen, and oftentimes when we think of our chromosomes, that is what comes to mind, and it is true that our cells do create these things. They do make these butterfly-looking things that you see on the screen in front of you. But the chromosome is effectively, it's more than that, if you want to think about it. You got to think of your chromosomes in terms of the double-stranded DNA as well, okay? So if we were to take this chromosome, which is, we call this highly condensed, which means all of our DNA that we see here has been folded up and packaged up really, really tightly into this thing we call the chromosome. Now, the chromosome is only actually present maybe 10%, 5 to 10% of the cell's life cycle. During the rest of the time, the cell is packaged, the DNA is packaged up into a form that looks something like this up here, either double-stranded, okay, double helical DNA, or in this conformation called chromatin, okay? And so it's not often that we see it super highly condensed like this chromosome down here. It is more often in one of these forms in the other 90% of the cell's life cycle, okay? And the reason for that is because we need to use the DNA, right? The DNA is supposed to be accessed. I put the wrong emphasis on the wrong syllable there. I meant to say the DNA is meant to be accessed, okay? The DNA is meant to be accessed. And when it becomes accessed, it means that we can express it, or we can turn it on, or we can get something from it, okay? In this highly condensed chromosome form, that's next to impossible. In this less condensed chromatin and double helical form, that is possible. We can open up stretches of that DNA and we can express it, and we can make proteins from it, okay? But what you do need to know is that during this process of the cell cycle, we take this double helical DNA, which is then packaged up into this chromatin fiber down here, and we highly package it up and highly condense it into this chromosome form. And the reason we do that during this process of the cell cycle is because it's easily moved. We can move it from place to place really, really easy. It is next to impossible to move this uncondensed DNA material that's up here. It's everywhere. It looks like spaghetti, okay? So we package it up, we put it in the chromosomes. Now, I've found a really good animation that I will have linked it into Classroom, but it's also linked to this picture if you can get it. It's just a YouTube video. It's about 1.5 minutes, and it shows how that double helix DNA actually coils up and folds up on itself and packages itself into the chromosomes. Okay, and I think that's going to be important to your greater understanding of how the cell's nuclei is able to do what it does during this process. Okay, so we move on. Every eukaryotic species has a characteristic number of chromosomes in each of its cells. And you guys probably knew that. Okay? So you can think of the chromosome in terms of the condensed form like you just saw, or you can think of it in terms of the uncondensed chromatin form. Either way we cut it, we called it a chromosome. Okay? And that's another fact that maybe you didn't understand or know. But each species has its own characteristic number of chromosomes. For instance, humans have, see if you can guess, 46. The great apes have 48. A highly utilized research animal called the fruit fly, Drosophila melanogaster, has 8 chromosomes. All right. And strawberries, another one that we utilize especially in high school labs, have 56 chromosomes. All right. So we can understand that it's not necessarily the number of chromosomes that makes an organism intelligent, so to speak, because strawberries don't think, right? They have 56. So more advanced does not mean more chromosomes. Less advanced does not necessarily mean less chromosomes. Okay, but each species has its own characteristic number of chromosomes. Now, in each one of these species, those chromosomes can be manipulated, right? And certain types of cells in those organisms are going to have certain amounts of chromosomes. Okay, so somatic cells, and this is again just kind of a vocabulary type review. These are terms that we're going to be throwing around quite often, not only in this chapter but in chapters next semester as well. Somatic cells have 2 sets of chromosomes. Somatic cells are what we consider to be normal, everyday, run-of-the-mill cells. Okay, so a skin cell or a muscle cell, okay, a bone cell. Those all have normal amounts of chromosomes. Normal. For humans, they all have 46. Okay, and so we call those somatic cells. Those are considered to be non-reproductive cells. Now, gametes, on the other hand, we're going to touch on this entire chapter about the creation of gametes through the process known as meiosis. These gametes have half as many chromosomes as a normal, everyday, run-of-the-mill somatic cell. So not only do we have to understand chromosomes in terms of their structure a little bit, but we also have to start to take into account chromosome number, okay? Because there are different numbers of chromosomes for different species, and even within those species, depending on what they are, they have different numbers of chromosomes in their different cell types as well. Okay? So keep all that stuff in mind as we work our way through. So what happens during cell division? In cell division, in preparation for cell division, DNA is replicated and the chromosomes condense. That is stuff that we will start to talk about a little bit more in depth, like when does this stuff happen. But you have to understand that when the cell wants to divide, it starts to replicate its DNA and it will condense the chromosomes to make them easier to move. Each duplicated chromosome has what are called 2 sister chromatids. Now, in an upcoming lesson, I'm going to discuss the definition of what a chromosome is, because there are multiple definitions of chromosomes that change, and this doesn't make it a whole lot easier for you guys, that change depending on the situation that a cell happens to find itself in, okay? But when a cell decides that it wants to duplicate, it has to duplicate its DNA as well, because one set has to go in one cell and another set has to go in another cell. And so what it does is it attaches these 2 replications, okay, the 2 replicated forms of DNA, it attaches them together by a centromere, okay? And a centromere is what attaches those sister chromatids. Now, again, this is probably a little bit confusing and there's not a whole lot of diagram to go along with what I'm telling you, but I want to make sure that you understand I'm going to spend a special time in class walking you through the definition of what a chromosome is and how we can determine what a chromosome is, okay? But here in front of you, we see different renditions of chromosomes. Okay, there are two different renditions of chromosomes here. I will make sure that you understand them a little bit later. Okay. So, how are chromosomes distributed during cell division? That's what we want to try to gain a better understanding of through this chapter. Okay. Eukaryotic cell division consists of mitosis, which is the division of the nucleus. So cell division itself is the process of taking a cell and making an exact copy of it. And that process is broken up into two distinct phases. Mitosis, which is the division of just the nucleus, and cytokinesis, which is the division of everything else inside of the cytoplasm. Okay, all of that wrapped into one is what we call cell division. All right, so we've spent time talking about the importance of the nucleus and the chromosomes that are found in the nucleus, because I want you to understand that what you ultimately know to be called mitosis is nothing more than the division of the nucleus. So we have to understand what's in the nucleus. All right. Gametes are produced by a variation of cell division called meiosis, which is something that we're going to tackle next semester, okay, in a completely different chapter that is totally related to something different, genetics, okay? So we're going to talk about meiosis later on. But do make sure that you understand that there is a big difference between meiosis and mitosis, even though they sound very similar, and even though they go through many of the same phases, okay? And so when we learn about meiosis later, I want to make sure that you understand that we are going to learn, or not necessarily learn, but apply some of the stuff that we learn in this chapter to that chapter, okay? But fundamentally, they are different, and meiosis yields non-identical daughter cells that only have one set of chromosomes. They have half the number of chromosomes. So you can see just they're totally drastically different. But I wanted to bring that term in right here because I know it's one that you've all heard before, and I know it's one that gets confused with mitosis, which we are going to learn in this chapter right now. Okay? So that'll do it for this introductory material. I'll come back with you to a couple of other videos that will break down the process of cell division into much more detail. So I'll talk to you guys later.